They said she was the runt of the litter, a fragile, useless bargaining chip handed over to a ruthless duke for a debt of blood. He wanted revenge. He wanted to break her. But when the silken garments finally fell, and he saw what her own family had already done to her, the monster wept. The year was 1884, and the Harrington estate, once a beacon of high society in the heart of London, reeked of stale brandy and impending ruin. Lord Richard Harrington sat behind his mahogany desk, a man whose gambling addictions and treacherous business dealings had finally caught up with him. He was a man who had built his fortune on the shattered remains of others, most notably the late Duke of Ashbourne, whom he had betrayed a decade prior. Now the late Duke's son had come to collect. Alastair Montgomery, the new Duke of Ashbourne, stood by the towering windows of the Harrington study. He was a striking man, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the colour of a storm-tossed sea, and a jawline that looked as though it had been chiselled from cold granite. He did not sit. He did not accept the glass of expensive Scotch offered to him. He simply stared at the trembling aristocrat before him, radiating a quiet, lethal menace. "You owe me £300,000. Richard Wonderful." Alastair said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the window panes. "You drove my father to an early grave, stole his shipping routes, and laughed while our family teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. I spent 10 years clawing my way back from the dirt, and now I own every single promissory note bearing your pathetic signature." Lord Harrington wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Alastair, please. Be reasonable." The market shifted. It was business, nothing personal. "It was entirely personal," Alastair corrected, turning to face him. "And so is my retribution. I will take your properties. I will take your ships. I will take the very coat off your back. But first I will take your pride." The doors to the study swung open. Standing in the threshold, ushered in by a nervous butler, were the 2 Harrington daughters. Beatrice Harrington the elder stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who knew she was a prize. Dressed in a vibrant crimson gown that accentuated her hourglass figure, she possessed the classic Harrington arrogance. She was meant to marry a prince, or at the very least, an earl. Beside her, half hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes, was Clara. If Beatrice was a blooming rose, Clara was a weed starved of sunlight. She was 20 years old, yet she possessed the frail, delicate frame of a sickly child. Her dresses were always slightly too large, her pale blonde hair pinned back tightly, and her eyes, a startling luminous grey, were constantly fixed upon the floorboards. Society whispered that Clara was a simpleton, a fragile, useless girl, kept locked away because she lacked the wit and beauty of her sister. Lord Harrington immediately gestured to Beatrice, pushing her forward like a prize mare at an auction. "Your Grace," Richard began, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading tone. "I cannot pay the debt in coin, but I can offer an alliance. Take Beatrice. She is the jewel of my house. Marry her and let our bloodlines unite. It is a fair exchange." Alastair looked at Beatrice. She tilted her chin up, offering a seductive, practiced smile. She was beautiful, yes, but Alastair felt nothing but disgust. To marry the jewel of the Harrington family would be to give them honour. It would be a rescue. He did not come to rescue them. He came to humiliate them. His stormy eyes drifted past the crimson gown and landed on the trembling shadow in the corner. Clara was clutching the fabric of her faded blue dress, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. She looked terrified of the space she took up in the room. A cruel, dark idea formed in Alastair's mind. What better way to insult the proud Lord Harrington than to reject his prized daughter and demand the defective one? What better way to punish the family than to take their weakest link, drag her to his isolated estate, and make her suffer for the sins of her father. I do not want your prize, Richard, Alistair said softly. He walked slowly across the Persian rug, coming to a stop just a few feet from where Clara stood. She flinched instinctively, pulling her shoulders up as if expecting a blow. I will take the runt, Alistair declared, pointing a gloved finger at Clara. The room erupted into chaos. Beatrice gasped in sheer indignation, her face turning as red as her dress. You would choose the half-wit over me. You cannot be serious, Montgomery. Lord Harrington sputtered his face, draining of colour. She is unwell. She is clumsy, silent, and entirely unsuited for society. She cannot host, she cannot converse. She is a broken thing. Then she will fit perfectly into the life I have planned for her, Alistair replied coldly. He looked down at Clara. Pack whatever meagre belongings she has. The wedding will take place tomorrow morning, by special license. She leaves with me by noon. If you refuse, I will have you thrown into debtor's prison before the sun sets. Throughout the entire exchange, Clara did not speak. She did not cry. When her father, shaking with rage and humiliation, grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her toward the door, she merely stumbled, righted herself, and nodded. The next 24 hours were a blur of cold transactions. There was no grand ceremony, no flowers, no celebratory feast. They were married in a damp, empty chapel by a nervous vicar. Alistair barely looked at his new bride as he slipped a heavy cold gold band onto her painfully thin finger. When they entered the grand carriage to begin the long journey to Ashbourne Manor in the desolate moors of Yorkshire, the silence between them was deafening. Alistair sat across from her, observing his new duchess with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. She sat rigidly upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery. She had not shed a single tear since leaving her family. Do you know why you are here, Clara? He asked, his voice cutting through the rattling of the carriage wheels. She blinked slowly, turning her head to look at him. Her grey eyes were devoid of the defiance or terror he expected. Instead, they were incredibly hollow, like a deep, abandoned well. Yes, Your Grace, she replied. Her voice was a mere whisper, unused and raspy. I am the payment, Alistair sneered. Do not expect a fairy tale, little bird. Your father ruined my family. You are here to serve as a daily reminder of his defeat. You will find no comfort at Ashbourne. I will not coddle you, and I will not pretend to care for a Harrington. He waited for the tears. He waited for her to bury her face in her hands and weep for her lost life, as any pampered noblewoman would. Instead, Clara simply looked back out the window. I do not require comfort, Your Grace. I require very little. Her apathy infuriated him. He had intended to break her spirit, but it seemed the girl before him barely had won to begin with. He leaned back against the leather seat, his jaw tight. We shall see, he thought. We shall see how long the frail little Harrington can survive the cold. Ashbourne Manor was a sprawling Gothic fortress of dark stone, perched on the edge of a wind-swept moor. It was a beautiful but intimidating place, filled with long, echoing corridors, massive hearths, and servants who moved like silent ghosts. Upon their arrival, Alistair summoned his head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern, non-nonsense woman who had served the Montgomery family for 3 decades. Put her in the east wing, Alistair commanded, loudly ensuring Clara could hear every word. The old nursery chambers. Do not light the fires unless the temperature drops below freezing. She is to have no personal maid. If she wishes to eat, she will take her meals in her room, and she will eat whatever the staff leaves over. She is the Duchess of Ashbourne, in name only. Mrs. Gable shot a quick, pitying glance at the shivering, pale girl standing in the foyer, but she nodded. Yes, Your Grace, yes. Alistair turned on his heel and strode away, expecting that within 3 days, Clara would be at his study door, weeping and begging to be sent back to London, or at least begging for a warm fire and a proper dinner. But 3 days passed, then a week, then 2. Clara never knocked on his door. She never complained. In fact, she was practically invisible. Alistair found himself growing increasingly frustrated by her lack of reaction. He began to observe her from afar, trying to decipher the puzzle of his captive bride. What he saw only confused him further. Clara did not act like a ruined noblewoman. She acted like a survivor of a war camp. One afternoon, Alistair watched from a second-story balcony as Clara walked through the gardens. A heavy rain had fallen the night before, leaving deep puddles of mud. A gardener accidentally dropped a heavy sack of fertilizer near her, causing a loud thud. Any normal lady would have startled. Clara didn't just startle. She dropped entirely to the ground, curling into a tight defensive ball, her arms wrapping protectively over the back of her head. She stayed there trembling violently in the mud until the gardener apologized profusely and backed away. Only then did she slowly, cautiously uncoil, brushing the mud from her ruined dress with shaking hands. Alistair frowned, an unsettling knot forming in his stomach. A few days later, Mrs. Gable approached Alistair in his study, her usually stoic face lined with deep concern. "Your Grace, forgive me for intruding," the housekeeper said, wringing her hands. "It is about the Duchess." "Has she finally decided to complain about the cold?" Alistair asked, not looking up from his ledger. "No, Your Grace. That is the problem. It was bitterly cold last night, a frost on the windows. I brought her a bucket of coal against your strict orders, I confess. But when I tried to light the fire, she panicked. She begged me to take it away." Alistair finally looked up, his brow furrowed. "Begged you? Why?" Mrs. Gable swallowed hard. She said she hadn't earned it. She said if she took the warmth without earning it, there would be a punishment. Your Grace, she sleeps on the floor. I made up the bed with fresh linens, but I found her curled up on the rug beneath the window. And the food, she only eats a few bites and hides the rest wrapped in napkins beneath the loose floorboards. I fear the girl is deeply unwell." Alistair's irritation flared, but this time it was laced with a strange, creeping dread. "She is just playing the victim, Mrs. Gable, trying to win the staff's sympathy because she cannot win mine. Ignore her theatrics." But despite his harsh words, Alistair could not shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. The puzzle pieces of Clara Harrington did not fit the picture of the spoiled, deceitful family he despised. The climax of his vengeance came crashing down on a Tuesday evening amidst a violent autumn thunderstorm. Lightning tore through the blackened sky, and thunder rattled the heavy stones of Ashbourne Manor. Alistair was in the library when the door burst open. It was Dr. Lewis, the local physician who had been visiting the estate to tend to a stable boy's broken arm. "Your Grace, come quickly," Dr. Lewis shouted out of breath. "It is the Duchess. I found her collapsed in the eastern corridor. She is burning with a severe fever." Alistair stood up, his jaw setting into a hard line. A fever likely caught from sleeping on the damp floor, out of pure stubbornness. "Fine. I will come." He followed the doctor up the winding stairs to the east wing. They entered the frigid room. Clara was lying on the bed, finally on the bed, thrashing wildly in the grip of delirium. Her face was flushed with unnatural heat, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Mrs. Gable was at her side, trying to hold her down while weeping softly. "She was wandering the halls in the dark," Dr. Lewis said quickly, opening his medical bag. "Her lungs are congested. We must cool her down immediately, or her brain will boil. Mrs. Gable, we need to remove her heavy dress. It is soaked through with sweat." Clara was wearing a high-necked, thick wool dress, the same style she always wore, no matter the weather. As Mrs. Gable reached for the buttons at Clara's collar, The frail girl's eyes flew open. Though glassy with fever, they were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "No." Clara shrieked a sound so raw and guttural it made Alistair step back. She fought with surprising strength, swatting the housekeeper's hands away. "No, please don't. Father, please, I'll be good. I'll be quiet. Don't look. Please don't look." "Hold her arms, Your Grace," Dr. Lewis commanded, struggling to keep the girl still. "If we don't get this damp wool off her, she will die tonight." Alistair stepped forward. He felt a surge of annoyance at the disruption, but he grabbed Clara's wrists. They were so incredibly thin he felt he might snap them if he squeezed too hard. As he pinned her wrists to the mattress, Mrs. Gable grabbed a pair of medical shears from the doctor's bag. There was no time for buttons. With 2 swift cuts, Mrs. Gable sliced through the thick wool at the back of the dress, pulling the heavy fabric apart to expose the Duchess's bare back. Alistair opened his mouth to order Mrs. Gable to fetch cold water, but the words died in his throat. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The storm raging outside faded into white noise. Alistair stared down at his wife's exposed back, his heart slamming against his ribs in slow, sickening thuds. His hands holding her fragile wrists began to tremble violently. Clara's back was a canvas of butchery. From the base of her neck to the dip of her spine, there was scarcely an inch of unblemished skin. There were deep, jagged white scars from what looked like a riding crop. There were circular, puckered burn marks clustered near her shoulder blades, as though cigars had been stubbed out on her flesh. There were newer, angry red welts that had not yet fully healed wrapping around her ribs. It was not the result of an accident. It was the deliberate, systematic torture of a human being. "Dear God in heaven," Dr. Lewis whispered, dropping his shears. Mrs. Gable clamped a hand over her mouth, a stifled sob tearing from her throat. Alistair couldn't breathe. He looked at the horrific landscape of scars, and then he looked at Clara's face, which had finally gone slack as she passed out from the exhaustion of her fever. "She is a broken thing," her father had said. Alistair stumbled backward, dropping her wrists as if he had been burned. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding train, the oversized clothes, the cowering, hiding food under the floorboards, the fear of unearned warmth. He had brought her here to punish her for being a spoiled, arrogant Harrington. He had wanted to break a pampered noblewoman. Instead, he had taken a girl who had lived her entire life in a domestic torture chamber. A girl systematically brutalized by the very man Alistair hated most in the world. And Alistair had locked her in a freezing room, starved her, and treated her like dirt. He hadn't broken the proud Harrington family. Lord Harrington had simply handed his favourite punching bag to a monster who promised to finish the job. Alistair fell to his knees beside the bed, his large, calloused hands hovering over her scarred back, terrified to even touch her. A ragged, choking sound tore from his chest as the ruthless, unfeeling Duke of Ashbourne finally shattered. "Save her!" Alistair rasped, his voice breaking as he looked up at the horrified doctor, with tears streaming down his face. "Save her, doctor. Please." For 3 days and 3 nights, the Duke of Ashbourne did not leave the master suite. He had ordered Clara moved to his own chambers, where the roaring hearth kept the room sweltering, and the massive mahogany bed was piled high with the softest down quilts in the manor. Mrs. Gable and Dr. Lewis had fought valiantly to bring the Duchess's fever down, but it was Alistair who sat beside her hour after hour. He was the one who carefully dabbed her brow with cool cloths, who coaxed drops of broth past her cracked lips, and who held her hands when the night terrors made her thrash and cry out for mercy from her father's phantom whip. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, leaving pale winter sunlight spilling across the thick Persian rugs. Clara slowly opened her eyes. The heavy, suffocating weight of the fever had lifted, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She blinked at the ornate canopy above her, her mind sluggish. This was not the freezing nursery. She felt the heavy silk of the sheets and the radiating warmth of a massive fire. Panic immediately seized her throat. She had taken warmth she hadn't earned. She was in the Duke's bed. The punishment for this transgression would be severe. She scrambled backward, tangling herself in the blankets, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. Her sudden movement caught the attention of the man sitting in the armchair near the window. Alistair stood up. He looked terrible. His pristine cravat was gone, his shirt rumpled, and a dark shadow of stubble coated his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara in her tracks. The cold, stormy malice that usually resided there was completely gone. "Clara," he said softly, holding his hands up, palms open, as one might when approaching a terrified wounded doe. "Do not move too quickly. You are still very weak." She pressed her back against the headboard, trembling. I apologize, Your Grace," she stammered, her voice raspy. "I did not mean to intrude in your chambers. I will go back to the nursery. I will sleep on the floor. Please do not fetch the crop." Alistair squeezed his eyes shut, a muscle feathering in his jaw as a fresh wave of self-loathing washed over him. When he opened them, they were shining with unshed tears. He slowly lowered himself to sit on the edge of the mattress, keeping a respectful distance. "There is no crop in this house. Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and you will never sleep on a floor again. Not for as long as I draw breath." Clara stared at him, confused. "But, my father—" "Your father is a monster," Alistair interrupted gently. "And I was a blind, arrogant fool. I saw the name Harrington, and I wanted blood. I thought I was punishing a spoiled heiress. I never knew, Clara. I swear on my life, I never knew what he did to you." Clara looked down at her hands. The memory of the doctor cutting her dress away rushed back. She pulled the quilts up to her chin, her face burning with shame. "You saw," she whispered. "I am ruined. I am ugly." "Look at me," Alistair commanded softly. She hesitated, then raised her luminous grey eyes to meet his. "You are not ruined," he told her, his voice fierce with a newfound conviction. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. You survived a tyrant, and you survived my cruelty with quiet dignity. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for how I treated you, Clara. If you wish to leave this place when you are well, I will set you up in a private estate with all the wealth you could ever need. But if you allow me to try, I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are safe here." For the first time in her 20 years of life, someone was looking at Clara not as a burden, not as a punching bag, and not as a bargaining chip. He looked at her with reverence. A single tear spilled over her lashes, tracing a warm path down her pale cheek. "I am very tired of being cold, Alistair," she whispered. Alistair's chest tightened. He reached out his movements, agonizingly slow, and gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "Then you shall never be cold again, my Duchess." Over the next 6 months, Ashbourne Manor transformed. The heavy dark drapes were pulled back to let in the sunlight. The roaring fires never ceased. Mrs. Gable oversaw the creation of a brand-new wardrobe for Clara gowns, made of the softest silks and lightest cottons designed to brush gently against her sensitive scars without causing pain. Slowly, the terrified girl who flinched at loud noises began to fade. Clara learned to smile. She learned that dropping a teacup resulted in a joke, not a beating. She learned to walk the gardens without fear, and most importantly, she fell deeply, quietly in love with the formidable Duke who worshipped the very ground she walked upon. Spring had finally arrived in Yorkshire when the peace of Ashbourne Manor was violently interrupted. An opulent carriage bearing the Harrington crest rolled up the gravel driveway. Lord Richard Harrington stepped out looking significantly more haggard than he had 6 months prior. Behind him trailed Beatrice, draped in expensive furs she could no longer afford. They had come expecting victory. Richard had heard the whispers in London society that the Duke of Ashbourne's new bride was never seen, that she was locked away, surely broken by the Duke's notorious temper. Richard was banking on Alistair being tired of his revenge and ready to negotiate a new financial settlement to be rid of the defective girl. Alistair received them in the grand drawing-room. He stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in hand, looking every inch the powerful lord of the manor. "Alistair, my boy," Richard proclaimed with forced joviality, stepping into the room. "We thought it time to check on my dear daughter, though I suspect you have found her lacking. As I warned you, Clara is a fragile, useless thing." Beatrice scoffed, adjusting her fur. "If you are quite finished punishing her, Your Grace my father and I are willing to take her off your hands. For a modest allowance, of course. Perhaps now you realize you should have chosen a true lady to bear your title." Alistair took a slow sip of his brandy, his eyes entirely dead. "You misunderstand my silence, Richard. I have not been ignoring society, because I am embarrassed by my wife. I have been busy." "Busy?" Richard frowned. "Yes. Busy purchasing the remainder of your outstanding debts to the Crown," Alistair said smoothly, "and busy hiring the finest private investigators in London to scour your estate's ledgers." Richard's face drained of blood. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about embezzlement fraud and the theft of royal tariffs," Alistair replied, his voice dropping into a lethal register. "I handed the evidence to the magistrates 3 days ago, but that is merely for the money you stole." Alistair stepped away from the fireplace, closing the distance between him and Lord Harrington. "For what you did to Clara's back, I ensured the magistrate was also handed sworn medical testimonies from my physician. The Crown does not take kindly to lords who torture their dependents to the point of disfigurement." Beatrice gasped, stepping back. You know." "I know everything," Alistair snarled, grabbing Lord Harrington by the lapels of his coat, lifting the older man onto his toes. "You handed me your daughter to use as a whipping boy, but you forgot one crucial detail, Richard. She is a Montgomery now, and I protect what is mine." The heavy oak doors of the drawing-room swung open. Lord Harrington choked, his eyes bulging as he looked past Alistair's shoulder. There stood Clara. She was no longer the shrinking, malnourished shadow in an oversized dress. She wore a stunning gown of deep emerald velvet, her pale blonde hair styled elegantly with diamond pins that caught the sunlight. Her posture was impeccable, her chin held high, and the color in her cheeks radiated health and quiet power. She walked into the room, coming to a stop beside her husband. Alistair immediately released Richard, letting the ruined lord stumble backward, and placed a protective, loving hand on the small of Clara's back. "Clara," Richard breathed out, trembling. She looked at her father, and then at her sister, her grey eyes clear and completely devoid of fear. "Inspector Davies is waiting for you in the courtyard. Lord Harrington," Clara said, her voice steady and ringing with a newfound authority. "You will leave my home now, and you will never speak to me or my husband again." Outside, the heavy boots of the local constabulary could be heard, marching up the steps. Richard Harrington fell to his knees, babbling pleas for mercy, while Beatrice wailed in horror as 2 officers entered to drag them away to the debtor's prison and the criminal courts. Alistair and Clara did not watch them go. As the sounds of the carriage being commandeered by the police faded down the driveway, Alistair turned to his wife. He reached out gently, cupping her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, searching her eyes. Clara leaned into his warm palm, a beautiful, genuine smile spreading across her lips. The scars on her back would always remain a map of where she had been. But the man standing before her was the compass pointing to where she was going. "I have never been better, love," she whispered. "I am finally home." What an absolute roller coaster of revenge, redemption, and true love. Alistair proved that a real man doesn't break a woman. He helps her heal and destroys the monsters who hurt her. Did Clara's stunning emerald gown moment give you chills? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Hit that like button if you loved Alistair's ruthless defense of his wife. Share this dramatic tale with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical romance stories.